The Torah says that Hashem has a hand, but isn't this just a metaphor? The Torah also says that Hashem loves us, but how can he have an imperfect human emotion? And what has this got to do with our relationship with him? If you think you really love, and Hashem doesn't, you've got it backwards. We are the metaphor. In this video series, my goal is to release your mind and soul to be able to freely think about Hashem in the way the Torah talks about him. In the last episode, we discussed how the descriptions of Hashem are meaningful, there is a deep truth behind them, and that doesn't even contradict the Rambam. In fact, the Kabbalists say that Rambam did not go far enough in protecting Hashem's essence, yet they hold that the descriptions have a truth to them. And we showed even the Rambam calls them actions. Now, we're going to discuss in this episode what actions are and what essence is, what the difference is between them, and what is the connection between them, and how understanding this in both ourselves and with regards to Hashem will unlock everything. As you can see, we're getting higher now, so let's pause and catch up on everything we're discussing, because it can get quite confusing. Let's lay it out in the same way that the Rambam does, and we'll avoid ourselves getting lost in all the philosophy. So the Rambam splits it up like this. 1. Hashem himself is one, and he calls Hashem himself a pure essence. And it is that essence that the theological statements of perfection, unity, and unchangeability apply. 2. Hashem acts in the creation, and his actions, which are sometimes called his expressions and his revelations, are not his essence, even though they too, as we saw in the last episode, are infinite, beyond our own imagination, beyond the physical. Now, if we fail to maintain the difference between essence and these expressions, these actions, then we will be implying that Hashem is composite and not truly one, chas v'shalom. 3. Understanding both the difference and the connection between his essence and his expressions, and likewise understanding the difference between him and us, i.e. between his expressions and our expressions, is the key to understanding everything, the key to unlocking the entire discussion. It's sophisticated, but if you remember this structure, essence versus expression, and his essence and expressions versus ours, you will be able to follow along everything that comes next. Again, understanding the difference and connection between his essence versus his expressions, as well as understanding the difference between him and us, his expressions and our expressions, is the key to all this. So, back to the Tzedek. We said that he used the words simple meaning when it comes to how we should understand the Torah's descriptions of Hashem. We should understand them in their simple meaning. But we highlighted there, very importantly, that he didn't say physical meaning, a very important point. It's also true that we don't mean to say that God is spiritual either. Even the highest spiritual realm is a distant metaphor for the truth of his essence and being, no closer than even the lowliest physical pebble. That's how great and exalted he is. However, as we've been saying, we are the Mashal and he is the Nimshal. This applies to everything, to his essence and our essence. Yes, we have an essence. We're going to get onto that soon. To his expressions and our expressions, we have expressions too. Even to the way essence and expression connect, both in him and in us. This applies to all creation. So now, let's take a moment to understand what Mashal and Nimshal is. Because like we said, we are the Mashal in terms of our essence and our expressions, and he is the Nimshal of both of those. His essence is the Nimshal of our essence, and his expressions are the Nimshal of our expressions. And this is key, because without grasping this, we cannot understand how the Torah speaks about Hashem truthfully, yet without limiting him. Rambam says throughout the Moreh Nevuchim, but especially in Part 1, chapters 56 and 57, that there is absolutely no comparison between us and him in any way whatsoever. He calls it homonym, which I guess is even stronger than metaphor. This applies even to the terms like existence, power, life, will, wisdom, first, last. Hashem is first, Hashem is last. What does it mean for us to have a hand and Hashem to have a hand? But they are nothing alike, share no common definition at all. A good way to illustrate this is through the idea of a parable, a mashal. A parable is a teaching device to help someone understand something by dressing it up in a story. The story is nothing like the concept that is there to explain, but and this is key, the truth of the concept is found in the story. For example, we want to teach children about greed, quite a sophisticated concept for young children. We want to teach them how it comes from selfishness and it leads to theft, and no actual gain, but rather a loss whenever we are greedy. This is far too abstract for infants, for young children to understand, so we tell them a story about a fox who, in his greed, broke through a hole in a vineyard fence and gorged himself on grapes to his heart's satisfaction. But then he was too fat to get out the same hole. So, in the end, he had to fast in order to get out. Cute story, right? Well, the abstract concept of greed is very different, in fact, absolutely incomparable to a fox gorging himself. So different that if the child was to go home and tell his mother, "Today we learn about foxes in school," the parent would likely call the teacher and complain, saying, "You're not teaching my kid what you're supposed to teach. You're supposed to be teaching about morality, not foxes." And the teacher, for his part, would be upset, saying, "No, I didn't teach about foxes. What are you talking about? I was teaching about greed." There is absolutely no comparison between the figures and events of a parable and the actual lesson the parable is coming to teach. Literally nothing at all. However, and this is important, the entire truth is there, reachable only through wisdom and perception. And when the child grows, matures, and thinks deeply about the parable, the child will learn about the original Nimshal. If the parable is perfect, the child would learn everything about it. All the details are there. For example, the fox is chosen wisely because foxes are cunning and arrogant, and this teaches that greed is rooted in arrogance. In a perfect Mashal, the student can absorb the entire idea of greed purely from the story of a fox and some grapes, or at least he will as he gets older and contemplates the Mashal, which, like a time release capsule, will gradually make him an expert in the entire idea in its very truth. When he eventually does study about greed directly, he will recognize it. Get it? The Rabbi Rashab thus explains in Maimah V'Yadata that our entire world is a perfect metaphor of Hashem's truth and being. In fact, a metaphor within a metaphor, many layers deep, but that's not for here. This principle, that the world is a perfect mashal for divine truth, is a cornerstone of Chabad Hasidut, beginning already in the Alter Rebbe's Tanya Shah HaYichud V'Ha'emunah, and that is rooted in the Zohar and developed deeply by the Rabbi Rashab here. The Tzedek traces this idea as part of the mitzvah of Ha'amanat Elokut in Derech Mitzvatecha in the prologue and in part 1, going all the way back to the Rambam. See there. So therefore, we can conclude that the reality that we exist in is nothing at all like his truth and being, and saying so is heretical, just as foolish as the child who thinks that the lesson was about foxes and not greed. But that does not mean that there is no connection between us and him. On the contrary, it's a perfect metaphor, and thus nothing is lost in the mashal, and nothing extraneous is added to the mashal either. If we utilize the wisdom of the Torah, we can indeed learn everything about Hashem that it is possible for a creation to know. The issue of thinking about him in our terms is that we are the mashal, so we should instead be striving to see through the mashal. Because it is a perfect mashal, it is ultimately true and not a necessary fiction as some people have mistakenly come to conclude. Now, with all this, we can understand the strong statements such as that Hashem is ineffable, there is no comparison whatsoever to anything with him, and anything that can enter our mind is just pure imagination on our part, and thus the descriptions of the Hashem in the Torah are anthropomorphic. Indeed, he is ineffable, but the correct understanding is not that the Torah is being anthropomorphic, but if you're listening carefully, you realize that he created us to be theomorphic, right? Meaning, we are the metaphor. Thus, returning to the Tzedek statement, when the Torah describes Hashem, we are meant to take it in its simple meaning, not in the sense of literal physicality, chas v'shalom, but in the sense that the statement is truly true. These descriptions, his hand, his will, his love, are more true than our human expressions of the same terms. Ours are the metaphor, his are the reality. Amitat mitziut Hashem. That is why we cannot picture them, not because they are false, but because they are so utterly true and exalted that they are ineffable, beyond mental representation. That's the real meaning of kiviyachol, so to speak. It's not a disclaimer, it's a reverent pause, It signals what I'm saying is absolutely true, but I have no words to express it adequately. As if it were possible to say such a thing. Because it's not possible to say what is truly true. It's beyond words. As the Rabbi says, and so it is with love, so to speak, kaviyachal. There is no stronger expression. So we say kaviyachal as if to say, this is the entire love of the Almighty for the Jewish people. But in truth, it is even stronger, utterly beyond all comparison. In other words, we must never say Hashem doesn't really love you. That's not a pious statement. It is a tragic misunderstanding. Instead, we must say, Hashem's love for you is so infinite, so perfect, so true, that you cannot even fathom it. That doesn't make the relationship less real, it makes it infinitely more real. And this is the truth. Our view indeed necessitates us in looking at ourselves as theomorphic in order to avoid violating our beliefs in Hashem's oneness and perfection, while still being able to climb the ladder cautiously towards Him. So in the next episode, let's get deeply into the actual difference between essence and expression, because we're going to have to cover that, and then we'll be able to show a similarity between us and Hashem, one that unlocks everything. And this similarity between Him and us is everything we need to unlock the notion that just like His emotions are not Him, which is true and important, it's the same with us. We are not our emotions, and thus saying that Hashem doesn't have emotions does not mean He doesn't feel for us. Stay tuned.